David, you're in Portland, right?
I'm in Portland.
Yeah.
I'd like to go over metaphors. Are you sure you want this part recorded?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because I'm sure I'll have to refer back to it for the rest of my life.
or chop it out of any final version.
Oh yeah, I'm going to edit. I'll edit the whole thing. So
Save
don't
it for
worry.
Okay,
this
good.
for the subpoena that's coming.
Yeah. Well, uh, I read Vico's New Science a number of years ago, and he talked about metaphors. We can't talk without metaphors. They're embedded in language. Things like to be able to see into and grasp, and you almost don't even think of them because they're so essential to how we talk. But then we build with further metaphors, which are almost like analogies. And then when we explain things, we get in the habit, sometimes a bad habit. And I noticed Chris King did at least because in writing papers academically, you can't overdo the metaphors. You have to say something fairly precisely, which of course takes more work, more time. But when metaphors get built on metaphors, or when you take a metaphor and run with it, they start to either get absurd or just not as clear, not as precise. So anyway, I was listening to and I felt that in the Holier Demands, we got a little bit out there in terms of metaphors. I thought it became like maybe say a crutch, a bad habit. It's easy to do when you don't have precise thinking, and I don't claim to have precise thinking, but I do kind of pay attention to metaphors. So anyway, I was listening to the talk, and so Michael gets the worst of this critique. So, but it's loving, and so you just have to take that in mind. So when talking, and all these metaphors, I'm not saying they're all bad, but I just noticed them. So Michael was talking about ordination is like a big horse. You got to see where it takes you. You have to become one with it. Okay, well, I understand. This is and then very soon after that, this is one of those forks in the road when one takes on Jesus Christ in humility, or let it go to your head so that you are so big and so important. So that's totally understandable. The people who get shit done are the ones who move the needle. It was right about that point that I was beginning to start taking notes. I had to go back and watch the tape.
That's a metaphor.
Oh dear, oh dear.
I would never participate in these things if I thought it was going to get quoted back at me.
I know, it's scary. And then Michael says something. They're like a flywheel that's weighted. Now, when I got to that metaphor, I wasn't I'd followed everything, and that,
Like
and
a
the,
what?
and the
What was the
flywheel,
metaphor?
a flywheel that's weighted.
Oh yeah.
So I wasn't
Weighted
following.
flywheel.
So if we are working with a diverse group of people, they're all going to bring a house. Now, this was working on an earlier metaphor, the John Plummer used. But it's sort of an example of when you go with a metaphor too long and you have other questions, it doesn't make quite as much sense. If you're working with a diverse group of people, they're all going to bring a house. So you give them the technique, but keep them within the constraints of the house they live in. I totally understand because I understood John Plummer's metaphor. Here's a possible house, the human body. The human body is a kind of book. So now it's another metaphor in how it's organized. So much different information where each organ is like a separate city. So that's a bit of another metaphor. Has its own consciousness. So I see that as a house. Every human being has a stomach, the same organs, etc. But we have to take into consideration how these organs are evolving. Now with AI, we're we're into a whole new ball game, which of course ball game, the sports metaphors are, you know, they seem so perfect when you're into that sport. Now with John Plummer,
Oh, I get my turn.
yeah. These first of all, it wasn't so much, and I thought they were pretty good. So you use the term, the thing, what's under your nose, which is that's almost like an embedded metaphor now at this point in human language. So those things are not problems. We're in little tiny bubbles that can't find a way to get together. It's a short metaphor. Totally understood it. Some points to never said blows people right off their butt. Okay, now I'm starting to not be so clear. Touch that presence and let it run through you. Maybe I could find a way to steer the car without going off the road. So, little metaphor heavy. Jason Milton. Now, this was a very profound paragraph. Jason Miller and Josephine McCarthy sometimes go a little bit in this direction, that the reality is in the technique and all the rest is missing. And I don't think that's right. I can't always quite put my finger on it, but I think technique without a context doesn't work well. I've seen it quickly get out of balance. That's a profound point. I totally agree with it. I thought this is really quite a meaty bit of subject matter we're getting into here. So I liked it a lot. You can see some embedded metaphors in there. You need a house in which to live, and the house makes a difference. And I don't mean that this house is better than that house, but the house makes a difference in how the technique is enacted and how it works, how it's understood. So I think in stripping all of that off, I have not seen it go well. For me, it's like find the house you live in, then figure out how to make the engine run in that setting. Now, the engine is not obviously connected to a house, but the point was profound. So I was really enjoying the conversation. I probably should, I should have started by saying that more emphatically, because I thought that was just an excellent point. I don't know what I do with someone who had no house, which is exactly, that definitely spoke to me, where you just can't just talk about techniques. So then the electrical metaphors. And now some of them, Chris made a comment, pointing out their metaphors, but they really could be used in some situations quite exactly. So I heard him both giving the caution about the use of metaphors, but liking that use. Picking up on the house analogy, he said, I prefer a house built by many hands rather than by only one set of hands. I like that a lot. I totally agree with that. Then later on, and I couldn't quite get all of the electrical and mechanical metaphors that Michael was using, and I was starting to get a little lost. Chris said, I would like to use the language of technology, of spiritual technology, with some care and delicacy. That was a good point, because I think there is a materialistic bent inside that language, a utilitarian bent. A lot of people hear technology, like something they can just plug into the wall and run, just a matter of having the right technique. Now, it's all metaphors, but it's really a good insight, which I'm very concerned about. So I was liking this, but then like right after this talk, Michael, you sent out one of your daily emails was talking about inviting people to something. He said, you know, it's spirituality, but in way cooler language than what you've heard before. And the way cooler language sounded to me like, oh, that's going to be a lot of metaphors. Now, also, you do send out what's basically poetry on your daily, and it's good. And I was looking at the most recent one, or a fairly recent one, and it was metaphors, but it was concise. It was short. It gave a feeling. So I liked it. So I watch metaphors in myself, and I react cautiously when I hear too many of them. And I think, Michael, for you, it's just something to notice. That's all.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, this is great. You know, it's not often we get, you know, such good feedback on, you know, on a video or an interview or a podcast. And so this is really, really helpful. I think that for me, you know, for you guys, I mean, you're dealing in academia, and your language has to be precise. But me, I am not only not qualified to talk, you know, at that level, I'm speaking to a different audience, and they really rely on metaphor to get it, you know.
You know, this question about person being a person and being an individual. This is an area where Orthodox theology, traditional Christianity, can help me see the difference between an individual and a person, because we now, you know, in the modern world, you use the terms as though they're interchangeable, whereas the theological idea is that the person made in the image and likeness of God is this person through personal capacity of being, you know, a true mode of being, where you are not alone. In contrast to the individual, it's the individual that has the real crisis of faith, you know, and it's the individual that has the breakdown typically, because there's a certain isolation, and again, experiencing that sacramentally, there's just a profound. It takes, but it really is an initiation to enter into that.
Are we looking at the crucifixion maybe here, the death of the individual? My God, why hast thou forsaken me?
Well,
I was looking at it the other way, which was the uncovering of the divine image, but it is a crucifixion to the distractions which we have from that.
Well, I was also hearing in what you were saying, Father David, what was calling in mind was the relationship, and maybe I'm being a bit too Western here, but how the relationships between the persons in the Holy Trinity are. That's that communion amongst themselves that makes them individuate. It's not. I'm not sure that's kind of Augustinian. I'm not sure how to square that with more classical, like Cappadocian.
Well, even this word individual, it's kind of a modern word. It's sort of a combination of two things. In the Greek times, the idiotes, the idiot, as we would pejoratively say it now, which didn't have any such pejorative meaning, and then it just meant private versus the public. And then that word combined, the word individual is more used in science, referring to atoms and stuff like that. So you get this kind of blending in modernity, you know, after, I don't know, 1500, 1600. But so we use the words that way that I don't think were really used so this distinction that we have now between the individual and the person seems more necessary to grasp now, because we are unmoored, to use a metaphor, in a mobile society.
Yeah, it's one of the paradoxes of being human is that we don't really find ourselves as individuals without having to deal with a lot of other people, without really having to really work out to discover what it means to be an individual by lots and lots of relationship. It's, you find folks like looking for the perfect, like the perfect soulmate kind of thing, and they're just like they're going down their Tinder list and like, running through, and will I ever find my soulmate? Well, no, not if you keep doing that. You will never find your soulmate because you're not making yourself into the kind of individual that's worthy of, that's capable of having that kind of bond.
That's exactly right. This whole process, this then gets into our psychological language, but individuating or individuating from the group. Yes, I mean, this is one of the great things I loved about being in the Holy Order of Man's, Christ the Savior Brotherhood, now being in the Orthodox Church, was this process of distinguishing yourself from the group. And then becoming critical of the group, and then moving through that to learn. But by individuating, you then gain the capacity to be responsible for the group, which because the incompleteness is when you put yourself outside of it and then just criticize. You haven't gone through the initiation of what it means to be a responsible human being yet. So we can all critique, but to be able to critique from within, which I would say is the responsible use of critical thought, to take responsibility, to be accountability for standing up for truth in yourself, not arguing it outside of yourself. And this way we can be in flawed organizations. We are institutional beings. We live within so many identities, so many group identities. And the mass mind can wash through us and obscure this to us, or we really learn how to take responsibility. And taking responsibility always means saying something, if not unpopular, at least embarrassing. It puts you put yourself out there. In other words,
right.
Part of the
part of the individuation process, as I see it, is where you move from simply being able to repeat what you've learned to actually consuming what you learn. And it's a metaphor, but kind of, again, it gets very close to reality. When we eat food, we break it down, we digest it, and then it becomes our flesh. And that is the individuation process, and how it applies to what we learn. Because any of us can repeat ideas that we've heard, but have we really taken those ideas and processed and made them our own? And then from that point, then we can generate the very same idea, only in an entirely new way that is fresh and alive, which fights against that ossification process. How ideas.
I totally get exactly. I mean, this is Michael. I see this is what you've been really trying to do all along, because in organizations we have a certain language that just fits together and you can say it, and you don't really have to put much thinking to it. The words just, they fit together so perfectly.
Large language
using,
model. Yeah.
Yeah, and using trying to reframe some of that in a metaphorical way to give another look, is that's part of what we are doing. So I appreciate your aim there.
Yay.
And though I don't think metaphors are just, I don't think that's the way to get there either. But yeah, I understand that.
Duly noted.
Well, I want to return to something. I brought up my dissertation a few minutes ago, not to say that I wrote a dissertation, but it was actually it was about this point keeping in like thinking about the large language models and predicted language and all that stuff. I'll read things I wrote, and it's like, where did that come from? Like, where did this lovely expression? Like, I it's like I'm reading somebody else, right? Where does when this is, I think, also the experience that poets can have too. That sometimes the language comes up from within, but you're not repeating something else that you've heard. It's something new is coming, but again, it's like no more your product of your own genius, right? Like unless the genius is somehow not quite you, it's no more.
Yeah, Vico said it's the poets bringing forward some of these really perfect metaphors that had not been used, that then we do absorb, and they get embedded in our language, and that has historically been what the poets have done for us.
Well, we when we're writing our best homilies, our best academic work, and David, you said earlier that scholars need to be able to use metaphor, like and really lean into it and do it well, to use metaphor well. So it's like on either end of so we're looking at all the different ways that we mediate language into the world and use it and for whatever. On either end, it's like where are we? Where do we fit into this? Either I'm just cobbling together. I'm like generative AI producing and reproducing thoughts that are just out there swimming around. Or on the other end, I'm speaking forth something like a poet. Not necessarily me, but that the poet is speaking something that's new and fresh, but no more the poet than day-to-day quotidian language.
Can I ask a question? This is sort of esoteric in an academic sense. But
yeah.
Have you read Michael Polanyi?
Oh,
so John's nodding yes.
Yes, many years ago, but yes.
Yeah, it's yes. And
tacit talks about tacit knowing.
Yeah.
And you think about how so much of that exists in a child, but they don't have the words yet, or they also don't have all the organic space yet. But you are building on tacit knowing that precedes words.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about that a lot in terms of the spiritual path, because now some people are really auditory processors, which I'm not. And so I don't know how they could relate to this, but being myself more feeling oriented, kinesthetic and visual, the idea of not relying on words appeals to me. And so the particular strain or a direction or practice, hesychastic practice in Gregory Palamas and the later hesychus, Gregory Palamas talks about in the state of union with God, where words fall away. And that state of tacit experience, which he also says is when you are engulfed in light.
Mm.
The words just, our human words simply are not adequate, not needed. You don't need the words to mediate the experience.
Mm.
So that's something that I relate to, both in a striving high end and in a baby in the pre-literate, pre-verbal stage.
Mm.
I think we see this a lot in art and in athletics, martial arts, dancing, anything where we're immediately in the moment with this tacit knowing. Because the moment you stop and think about a dance move, you can't do it, right? Or if a diver is, going to do a triple flip, there's no thought there. All the thinking has already been done. So is that kind of what we're talking about?
It happens in speaking too. Like the moment you think, what am I going to do with my hands? Suddenly all you are is awkward hands.
We go here, we go there, we're a little bit,
like, even speaking, even talking is a full body thing. It's a full body form of expression. And there's choreography and dance and you ever been searching for a thought, or it's out here somewhere, and it's up here. I can reach up and pull it down.
Yeah.
So what's going on there? If I'm plucking my I'm engaged, I'm gesturing, but it's my idea, my thought, my word coming through my physical form, and
I think a lot about that in regard to pre-verbal children who are learning dimension. They're incorporating dimension viscerally, which then intellectual ideas have. And I don't know if people who are less kinesthetic feel it this strongly, but a tremendous dimensionality to thought.
Yes, right. Thoughts aren't just these wispy things floating behind our eyes, right? Thoughts are, where do thoughts live? They're at there. Of course, everything I'm saying out here is I'm experiencing it internally, but it's still out there, and my thinking is somehow suffusing the world of my experience.
I saw a stockbroker said to me, I believe in rational. I was wearing my robe and a cross, and he was, making it clear, believe in that stuff. He says, I'm just completely rational. It's everything's in the brain. That's where. I said, oh, really? I'd always thought of cognition as a full body experience, and he stopped because I could see in his eyes in that moment he thought that way too.
Mm-hmm.
That just wasn't the way he talked.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
As in it about this question of where a thought lives, where it's almost like it's a dimension where thoughts are have their own landscape. Like there are, if we work down into the architecture of thinking itself, there are certain columns, metaphorically speaking, there are columns that support the whole superstructure. So they're, this would take a lot more thinking, but it has a structure of its own. And if we were in that dimension, it would appear as a landscape or as a structure. And I've always had the intuition that the Platonic solids represent that structure. I think that's what's at the root of that whole idea, that thought has a kind of geometry to it, and that geometry can be dissected or analyzed in such a way as to better understand how thoughts are formed and how they relate to each other, and why, as in poetry, some thoughts fit and others don't. And there's almost a tactile sense of whether one word is right or not. There's a feeling, there's this tacit knowing of. And I think there is that dimension, because I have no other word for it. In that dimension, you actually feel your way through almost like a physical landscape and structure, and you get a sense of it, but it's a sense on a very much higher order than our five senses.
Yeah, I mean, Michael, when you were in Nashville and we went to the Steiner study group, the group's been reading Steiner's book Theosophy, and the section that I was just reading last night is basically all that. It's like this dimension of like the world of spirit, which is made of living thought, and that we come to experience, and that forms a landscape of living thought that we can move inside of. It must be emphasized above all that the spiritual world is woven out of the substance that constitutes human thought, substance in a very figurative sense, of course, but thought as it appears in human beings as an image or phantom of its real being. Our task as messengers of this spiritual world is to incorporate the spirit into the material world. And on and
here
on
we
and
are
on
at
it goes.
Sacraments.
Yes,
Here we are
Yeah.
at
we're right
Sacraments,
back at the
finally.
sacrament, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I mean, it's like a 20, 30 page section on basically what you just said. So
Great.
But Michael, I think you can get two programs out of this, because we haven't even started the sacraments yet.